cold wind swept through the ancient stone halls of the Hofburg Palace. But the true chill came from the parchments unrolled within. For centuries, the Habsburg dynasty ruled vast lands, their power shaping the lives of millions. But their pronouncements, those solemn edicts issued from gilded chambers, often unleashed a storm far greater than any winter gale. They shattered ancient customs, ignited furious rebellions, and redrew the very map of human existence in ways no one could have predicted. From religious freedom that felt like a cage to forced military service to land reforms that sparked riots, these decrees sent shockwaves across a sprawling empire. People whispered curses in hushed taverns, prayed in secret forests, and sometimes rose up with pitchforks and muskets. Here are 9 times the Habsburgs threw a wrench into the lives of their subjects, leaving a trail of shock, anger, and defiance. Number 9. Franz Joseph I's Ausgleich, the Compromise with Hungary, of 1867. The year was 1867. Vienna buzzed with a nervous energy, a strange blend of relief and resentment. Emperor Franz Joseph, his face etched with the burdens of a defeated empire, had signed a document that many believed would either save or utterly destroy his Rome. The Hungarians, a proud and fiercely independent people, had long clamored for greater autonomy. Their revolution in 1848 had been brutally crushed, but the embers of their desire for self-rule never truly died. Now, after a crushing military defeat by Prussia in 1866, the empire was vulnerable, and the Hungarians saw their chance. The Ausgleich, or compromise, was an intricate political dance, a grand bargain struck between the emperor and the Hungarian magnates. It effectively split the Habsburg Empire into 2 distinct parts: Austria with Vienna as its capital, and the Kingdom of Hungary with Budapest as its center. Each half would have its own parliament and internal administration governing its own affairs. There would be a shared army, a common foreign policy, and common finances, all overseen by the emperor, who would simultaneously be Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. In the sleepy villages of Transylvania, where Romanians had lived for centuries, news of the Ausgleich arrived like a thunderclap. Ian, a simple shepherd, tended his flock near a small wooden church. He had heard tales of Hungarian rule of taxes and landlords, but his family had always been Romanians. Now, he was told, his children would be educated in Hungarian, his village might be forced to adopt Hungarian names, and his pleas for justice would go before a Hungarian court. He remembered his grandfather speaking of the old days when the emperor in Vienna was far away, but still felt like a distant protector. Now the new masters were close, and they spoke a different language, practiced different customs, and did not seem to care for his people. Ian watched his sheep, but his mind raced with worries about his daughter Elena, who dreamed of becoming a teacher. What kind of world would she inherit? Across the Carpathian Mountains, in the fertile lands of Galicia, Polish nobles and Ruthenian peasants received the news, with their own mix of dread and anger. Count Stanislaw, a Polish landowner, had always believed in a strong, unified Austrian Empire. He saw the compromise as a betrayal, a weakening of the central authority that had protected his interests and his people. He had fought for the emperor, sent his sons to serve in the imperial army. Now the Hungarians had been elevated, given a status that the Poles, despite their own historical kingdom, had been denied. He saw the Ausgleich not as a compromise, but as a capitulation. His discussions with other Polish deputies in the Galician Diet turned bitter. They felt their sacrifices, their loyalty had been ignored. They too had dreams of greater autonomy, of a Polish state within the empire, but their voices were drowned out by the roar of the Hungarian settlement. Meanwhile, in Bohemia, the Czechs felt a deep sense of injustice. They too had a proud history, a kingdom that predated many others, and they had long argued for a similar arrangement to Hungary. František, a young Czech lawyer in Prague, meticulously read the articles of the compromise, his brow furrowed in disbelief. He saw the words clear and stark, outlining the division of the empire. Bohemia, his beloved homeland, was firmly placed within the Austrian, half its aspirations for a kingdom of its own, for a distinct Czech identity, utterly disregarded. For years, Czech intellectuals had written pamphlets, organized cultural societies, and pushed for recognition of their language and heritage. The Ausgleich felt like a slap in the face, a definitive statement that their efforts were in vain, that their future lay forever subservient to Vienna, while Budapest basked in its newfound glory. Franz attended secret meetings in smoky cafes, where whispers of resistance and calls for their own compromise grew louder and more desperate. In Vienna itself, many ordinary Austrians felt a sense of relief that the immediate crisis was averted, that the empire, though changed, had not completely crumbled, but underneath, a quiet anxiety festered. The empire had lost its wars, its prestige was diminished, and now this radical solution had been implemented. Shopkeepers worried about trade routes, soldiers wondered about their loyalties, and government clerks tried to understand the new administrative complexities. The sheer size of the Hungarian, half its new power, cast a long shadow. The shared ministries, the common army. They were supposed to bind the two halves together, but many wondered if they would simply become new arenas for conflict. The empire's very nature had been irrevocably altered, and no one truly knew what the future would hold for the diverse peoples within its vast borders. The compromise celebrated by some was seen as a grave injustice. By many others, a ticking clock set to expire. Number 8. Franz Joseph, the First's October Diploma, 1860, and February Patent, 1861. The Habsburg Empire groaned under the weight of its own diversity and a string of military defeats. Following the crushing loss to France and Piedmont Sardinia in 1859, the centralized, absolutist rule of Emperor Franz Joseph I seemed increasingly unsustainable. The emperor, a man of rigid principles, understood that something had to change. His empire was on the brink, financially strapped and politically unstable. The question was how much to give, and to whom. In October 1860, the emperor issued the October Diploma, a bold attempt to create a more federalized structure for the empire. It promised greater autonomy for the historic lands and their diets, or regional assemblies. These diets would have more say in local administration, education, and even some legislative matters. The aim was to appease the various nationalities and nobility, particularly the Hungarians, who had been simmering with resentment since their failed revolution in 1848. Count Kálmán, a Hungarian magnate, who had once tasted the bitterness of defeat and exile, read the Diploma with a cynical eye. He remembered the promises made before, promises that vanished like morning mist. The Diploma suggested a return to the historic rights of Hungary, allowing for its own internal administration and a greater role for the Diet of Hungary. Kálmán saw it as a hesitant step, a mere fragment of the full autonomy he and his fellow patriots demanded. He argued fiercely in Budapest salons and at the makeshift meetings of the Hungarian gentry that the Diploma did not go far enough. It still maintained too much central control, too much imperial power. It felt like a concession born of weakness, not a genuine embrace of Hungarian aspirations. His demands were for a truly separate but allied state. The Hungarian people, having fought so fiercely for independence, would not be easily satisfied with half measures. Meanwhile, in Prague, Gan, a Czech shoemaker, saw a glimmer of hope in the Diploma. For too long, the German language and culture had been dominant in the administration and education of Bohemia. The Diploma's emphasis on historical rights and regional diets offered a chance for the Czech language to regain its place, for Czech schools to flourish, and for Czechs to have a stronger voice in their own land. He spoke excitedly to his neighbors, pointing out paragraphs in the newspaper that seemed to promise a brighter future. Young Czech intellectuals like Václav, a student at Charles University, eagerly debated the implication. They saw an opening to push for a complete revival of the Bohemian kingdom, not just limited autonomy. They began to organize, to plan, to write petitions, their hopes rising that the tide had finally turned. However, the October Diploma was short-lived. It was too decentralized for some, particularly the German-speaking liberals in Vienna, who feared it would weaken the empire and lead to chaos. They pushed for a stronger central parliament and a more unified state. In response, just a few months later, in February 1861, Franz Joseph issued the February Patent. This edict drastically altered the course set by the Diploma. It established a new imperial parliament, the Reichsrat, with a stronger legislative role. While regional diets still existed, their powers were curtailed, and the central parliament was given more authority over common affairs. Crucially, representation in the Reichsrat was not based on direct universal suffrage, but on a complex system of curiae, or electoral colleges, which heavily favored the German-speaking population. Count Kallmann and the Hungarians saw the February Patent as a complete reversal, a direct slap in the face. Their hopes for true autonomy were dashed. The new Reichsrat, with its strong central authority and limited Hungarian representation, was unacceptable. They boycotted it entirely, refusing to send their representatives to Vienna. For the Hungarians, it was clear the emperor was reneging on the spirit of the Diploma. Their resistance hardened, leading directly to the years of intense negotiation that would eventually culminate in the Ausgleich. In Prague, Jan the shoemaker felt a crushing disappointment. The promise of the Diploma had been snatched away. The February Patent reinforced German dominance, making it clear that Bohemia's aspirations for self-rule within the empire would be stifled. Vaclav, the young student, burned with frustration. He saw the new electoral system as designed to keep Czechs out of power to marginalize their language and culture. Meetings in the cafes turned from hopeful planning to bitter denunciations of Vienna. Many now felt that negotiation was futile, that only strong, unwavering opposition would force the emperor to truly recognize their rights. The February Patent, intended to create stability instead, fueled nationalist fervor and deepened the divides within the empire, setting the stage for future conflict and continued unrest. The central authorities' attempt to find a middle ground had only alienated nearly everyone. Number 7. Joseph II's Robot Patent, Abolition of Serfdom's Worst Aspects, of 1781. For generations, the lives of peasants across the Habsburg lands were dictated by the will of their noble landlords. They were tied to the land, forbidden to leave without permission, and forced to perform endless hours of robot labor, unpaid work on the lord's estate. Their lives were a cycle of toil, hunger, and submission. Emperor Joseph II, a man driven by Enlightenment ideals, saw this system as a grave injustice and an impediment to progress. He believed in a rational, efficient state, and the traditional feudal system seemed an anachronism. In November 1781, he issued the Robot Patent, an edict aimed at radically transforming the lives of the peasantry. The patent did not fully abolish serfdom immediately, but it struck at its most oppressive elements. It granted peasants significant personal freedoms: the right to marry without the landlord's permission, the right to choose any trade or occupation, and the right to send their children to school. Crucially, it also gave peasants the right to leave their lord's estate, provided they found a replacement or paid a fee, effectively ending hereditary subjugation to the land. The aim was to turn serfs into free tenants, subject to law, not solely to the arbitrary will of their masters. Joseph II intended this to be a step towards a truly free peasantry, believing that free labor was more productive than coerced labor. In a small village in Bohemia, Joseph, a burly peasant with calloused hands, who read the edict aloud. Joseph's father had been a serf, his grandfather too. Their lives had been endless days in the Lord's fields, their children destined for the same fate. Joseph himself had seen his sister forbidden to marry a man from another village. Because the landlord disapproved, now the clerk read words that promised a different future. Joseph could send his youngest son Petr to the village school, not just for basic religious instruction, but to learn to read and write, perhaps even to become a craftsman in the nearby town. The thought stirred a hope he had never dared to entertain. He imagined Petr not bent over a plow, but working with tools, building a better life. However, the reaction of the nobility was swift and furious. Count Rudolf, a landowner whose family had held vast estates for centuries, raged in his manor house. He saw the robot patent as a direct assault on his ancient rights and the very foundation of his wealth. Without the forced labor of his peasants, his fields would lie fallow, his income would plummet, and his authority would be undermined. He gathered with other nobles, their faces red with indignation, denouncing the emperor as a tyrant who understood nothing of the delicate balance of rural life. They argued that the peasants would become lazy, that the land would go unworked, and that chaos would reign. Count Rudolf saw his traditional power eroding, his ability to command his workforce replaced by the cold, impersonal dictates of state law. He began to devise ways to circumvent the edict, to hold on to as much control as possible, perhaps by demanding higher rents or making it difficult for peasants to actually leave. The implementation of the edict was fraught with difficulty. Many peasants like Joseph were initially wary. Years of subservience had taught them caution. They had heard promises before that never fully materialized. Some landlords, like Count Rudolf, actively resisted, finding loopholes or simply refusing to comply. Relying on their local power to enforce their will, they threatened peasants who tried to exercise their new rights, making it nearly impossible for them to leave or find new trades. In some areas, peasants misinterpreted the edict, believing it meant they no longer had to pay any dues or perform any labor, leading to local uprisings and clashes with the landlord's overseers. Imperial officials, though committed to the reforms, were often too few and too distant to enforce the edict uniformly across the sprawling empire. In Silesia, a region known for its harsh landlord-peasant relations, the news of the robot patent ignited a furious debate. Some peasants, emboldened by the emperor's decree, began to openly defy their lords, refusing to perform traditional labor or demanding new terms. This led to violent confrontations as landlords called in local militias or even imperial troops to suppress the unrest. The chaos that ensued was a stark reminder that an edict, no matter how noble in its intent, could not instantly undo centuries of social order. Joseph's initial hope for his son, Pei, was tempered by the stories filtering in from other villages of resistance, of violence, and of landlords who found new ways to oppress their workers, simply changing the name of their demands. The robot patent had fundamentally altered the relationship between lord and peasant, but the path to true freedom for millions would be long and arduous, marked by continued struggle and deep-seated animosity. The old world was dying, but it was not going quietly. Number 6. Joseph II's decree on the dissolution of contemplative monasteries of 1782. In the Habsburg lands, monasteries had stood for centuries, their towering walls and ancient cloisters, a familiar sight in every landscape. They were centers of learning, charity, and spiritual devotion. But they also held vast tracts of land, accumulated immense wealth, and were seen by some as unproductive institutions. Emperor Joseph II, ever the pragmatist and rationalist, viewed many of these religious orders with suspicion. He believed that only those monasteries actively involved in useful work like teaching, nursing, or scholarly pursuits contributed meaningfully to the state and its people. Orders dedicated solely to prayer and contemplation, he argued, were a drain on resources and did not serve the public good. In January 1782, he issued a sweeping decree that shocked the empire: the dissolution of all contemplative monastic orders. The decree was precise. It ordered the closure of hundreds of monasteries belonging to orders such as the Carthusians, Carmelites, and Benedictine abbeys, nursing or scientific research. Their properties, lands, and immense wealth were to be confiscated by the state. This wealth, Joseph declared, would be used to fund a new religious fund, which would support parish priests, build new churches, and establish state-run hospitals and schools. The monks and nuns were given pensions and told to return to their families or join orders that performed useful work. Father Anselm, an elderly Carthusian monk in a secluded monastery high in the Austrian Alps, heard the news with a profound sense of despair. For 50 years his life had been one of quiet contemplation, prayer, and study within the monastery walls. This was his purpose, his life's work. The silence of the cloister, the ancient rituals, the devotion to God. This was the highest service, he believed, far more important than any worldly pursuit. To him, Joseph's decree was not just an administrative order. It was an attack on faith itself, a sacrilege. He watched as imperial officials accompanied by soldiers arrived at the monastery gates, their faces grim, their purpose clear. They inventoried every chalice, every book, every plot of land. Father Anselm saw his life's meaning dismantled before his eyes, the sacred made profane. He and his fellow monks were told to leave to find new homes, their community shattered, their quiet way of life obliterated. The local communities were deeply affected, though their reactions varied. In some areas where monasteries were seen as wealthy and distant landlords, some peasants quietly approved of the confiscation of land, hoping it might lead to lower rents or new opportunities. But in many other places, the monasteries were beloved institutions, providing charity, medical care, and education to the poor. Maria, a young woman in a small Styrian town, wept openly when the ancient Benedictine abbey where her aunt had been a nun and where Maria herself had received rudimentary schooling was closed. The abbey had cared for the sick, distributed alms, and offered solace. Now its doors were barred, its bells silent. The new state hospital was a grand idea, but it was far away and its administrators were strangers. Maria felt a sense of loss, a disruption of the familiar rhythm of her life and her community. The economic and social repercussions were immense. Thousands of monks and nuns were displaced. Vast libraries, some holding priceless ancient manuscripts, were scattered or sold off. Churches were stripped of their valuable art and artifacts, many of which were melted down for their precious metals. The art market of Vienna and other major cities saw a sudden influx of treasures, some finding their way into private collections, others simply lost to history. Land previously owned by the church was now administered by the state, sometimes leading to more efficient farming, but often causing confusion and dispute over existing tenant agreements. The change impacted the spiritual landscape. For devout Catholics, the closure of these sacred places was an affront, a sign of a government meddling in matters of faith that were beyond its purview. Bishop Clemens, a high-ranking church official, felt a profound sense of outrage and powerlessness. He understood the emperor's desire for efficiency, but he believed that the state had no right to dictate the nature of religious life. The church, he argued, had its own divine purpose, independent of worldly utility. He wrote impassioned letters of protest to Vienna, but they were largely ignored. He saw the decrees not just as an attack on monastic orders, but as a systematic attempt to subjugate the church to the state, to make it an instrument of imperial policy rather than an independent spiritual authority. He warned that such actions would alienate the faithful and sow deep resentment, creating a chasm between the people and their ruler. But Joseph II, convinced of the righteousness of his reforms, pressed on his vision of a rationalized, centralized state, overriding all objections. The closure of the monasteries left deep scars, a tangible symbol of the sweeping, often brutal nature of Joseph's Enlightenment reforms. Number 5. Joseph II's Patent of Toleration of 1781. For centuries, the Habsburg Empire was a staunchly Catholic realm. Protestantism, though present in many regions, especially Hungary and Bohemia, faced severe restrictions and often outright persecution. Public worship was forbidden, civil rights were limited, and conversion to Protestantism could lead to dire consequences. Jews, another significant minority, also lived under a host of discriminatory laws, confined to specific areas and professions, and subject to special taxes. Emperor Joseph II, influenced by the Enlightenment, found these policies irrational and counterproductive. He believed that a state should harness the talents of all its subjects, regardless of their faith, and that religious uniformity was not essential for political stability. In October 1781 he issued the Patent of Toleration, a groundbreaking yet controversial. The patent did not grant full religious equality, but it was a radical departure from past policies. It extended limited civil rights to Lutherans, Calvinists, and Eastern Orthodox Christians. They were allowed to build their own houses of worship, though without steeples or bells, and to maintain their own schools. They could now hold public office, own land, and enter professions previously closed to them. For Jews, the edict removed some restrictions on their economic activities, allowing them to participate more freely in trade and crafts, and opened up access to secular education. They were still not granted the same rights as Christians, and certain restrictions like marriage permits remained. Conversion to Catholicism was still encouraged and privileged. In a small town in Hungary, where the Reformed Calvinist faith had persisted despite decades of suppression, Lajos, a merchant, read the news with a mixture of elation and apprehension. For generations, his family had worshipped in secret, holding services in hidden rooms or remote clearings. He had watched his friends were arrested for possessing Protestant books or forced to convert. Now the emperor's decree promised them the right to build a proper church, a place where their children could learn their hymns openly. Lajos felt a surge of hope, imagining a future where his family could live without constant fear. He gathered with other Calvinists, their voices hushed, dreaming of a visible church, a bell to call them to worship, even if the edict specified no steeples or bells. The patent was a beacon, but it also highlighted how much further they still had to go for true equality. The Catholic Church reacted with a mixture of shock and outrage. Bishop Franz, a zealous defender of Catholic supremacy, saw the Patent of Toleration as an attack on the true faith and a dangerous opening for heresy. He argued that it undermined the divine authority of the Church and risked fragmenting the empire spiritually. For centuries, the Habsburgs had been the champions of Catholicism, battling Protestants and Turks. Now their own emperor was seemingly betraying this sacred legacy. Bishop Franz preached impassioned sermons against the edict, warning his flock of the dangers of religious pluralism and the erosion of moral order. He saw it as a slippery slope that would lead to spiritual decay. Many priests shared his alarm, feeling that their long-held monopoly on truth and moral guidance was being eroded by a secular ruler. For the Jewish communities, the patent brought significant changes, though not without their own set of complexities. In Vienna, Mendel, a Jewish tailor who had always lived within the confines of the Jewish quarter, found that the edict opened up new possibilities. His son Jacob, who had a keen mind, could now attend a state-run school, learning German and secular subjects, not just Hebrew and Talmud. This was a dream come true, a chance for Jacob to enter professions previously closed to Jews. However, the patent also came with conditions. It encouraged Jews to adopt German names, to speak German, and to integrate into mainstream society. Mendel wondered if his progress came at the cost of their cultural identity, if his son would forget their traditions in his pursuit of success. The new freedoms felt like a gift, but one that came with unspoken expectations. The Patent of Toleration, while revolutionary for its time, was not universally welcomed, even by those it sought to benefit. Some Protestants found the restrictions on steeples and bells humiliating, a reminder that they were still second-class citizens. Some Jewish leaders worried about assimilation and the loss of their community's distinctiveness. Many traditionalists, Catholic and non-Catholic, alike viewed the changes as a dangerous undermining of ancient traditions and social order. Joseph II, convinced of his enlightened vision, pressed on. But the edict, while alleviating some suffering, also sowed new seeds of discontent and cultural tension across the diverse lands of his empire. The concept of religious tolerance, revolutionary as it was, proved to be a complex and contested ideal. Number 4. Maria Theresa's Universal Conscription, Edict of 1770. The Habsburg monarchy had been humbled on the battlefield. The Silesian Wars fought against Frederick the Great of Prussia. had exposed the weaknesses of the Austrian army. Maria Theresa, a formidable ruler, understood that a powerful state needed a powerful military. Her existing army, relying heavily on foreign mercenaries and voluntary recruitment, was insufficient to defend her vast and often threatened lands. She resolved to transform it into a modern standing force, capable of competing with the likes of Prussia. To do this, she needed a constant, reliable supply of manpower. In 1770, she issued the Universal Conscription Edict, a decree that would forever alter the lives of young men and their families across the empire. The edict declared that all able-bodied men from the age of 17 to 40, with certain exceptions, were liable for military service. It established a system of recruitment districts where a certain quota of men had to be provided annually for the imperial army. Service was for life, or until disability, though later reforms introduced fixed terms. Peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, were particularly affected. Noblemen and their sons, clergy, and inhabitants of certain privileged cities were largely exempt, which only heightened the sense of injustice among the rural poor. In a quiet farming village in Lower Austria, young Karl was working in the fields when the imperial recruitment officer, a stern man with a clipped mustache, arrived. Karl was barely 18, his hands still raw from the plow, his future seemingly laid out before him. Marriage, land, a family. But the officer read from a list and Karl's name was called. His mother, Katharina, watched in horror as her son, her strong, healthy boy, was taken away. She clung to him, tears streaming down her face. Knowing that service was often a death sentence, the army was a world away from their peaceful village, a place of brutality, disease, and constant danger. Katharina saw her family's labor force diminished, her hopes for her son's future shattered. The edict did not just take a man, it took a son, a brother, a husband, a farmer, leaving gaping holes in families and communities. The nobility, largely exempt from direct conscription, still felt the impact of the edict. Count Heinrich, a prominent landowner in Bohemia, understood the necessity of a strong army for the empire's security. But he resented the burden placed on his peasants, his most valuable labor force. He worried about his fields going unplanted, his harvest ungathered because so many young men were taken for military service. While he himself would not send his sons to the common ranks, he had to provide recruits from his estates. This meant he had to manage the disruption, the anger, and the economic strain on his tenants. He also knew that a large standing army, though vital, was a hungry beast, demanding taxes and provisions that would ultimately come from his land and his people. The edict gave the state unprecedented control over the lives of his subjects, a power that even he, a lord, could not easily resist. Across the empire, evasion became a desperate game. Young men fled their villages, hiding in forests, feigning illness, or even mutilating themselves to avoid the dreaded call-up. Families paid bribes to corrupt officials, hoping to secure an exemption or substitute for their sons. The forests of Hungary and Bohemia became havens for deserters, who sometimes formed bandit gangs, further destabilizing the countryside. In some regions, especially in the more recently acquired territories, the edict sparked outright resistance. In Tyrol, where a strong tradition of local militia existed, the idea of universal conscription into a standing army was deeply unpopular. Villagers banded together, sometimes openly defying recruiters, leading to tense standoffs and occasional skirmishes with imperial troops. The social fabric of communities was strained, marriages were delayed, families lost their primary breadwinners, and the elderly and infirm were left without support. The edict fueled a deep resentment against the imperial government, especially among the rural poor, who saw it as another heavy burden placed upon them by a distant, uncaring authority. While Maria Theresa succeeded in building a powerful military machine, one that would serve the Habsburgs for over a century, the cost in human terms was immeasurable. Karl, now a soldier, found himself marching across distant lands, enduring harsh discipline and constant danger. His life irrevocably transformed. His village, like countless others, learned to live with the constant threat of the recruitment officer, a silent reminder of the emperor's power over their very lives. Number 3. Charles VI's Pragmatic Sanction of 1713. For centuries, the Habsburg succession had followed a clear rule. Only male heirs could inherit the crown. This ancient tradition had provided stability. But by the early 18th century, Emperor Charles VI faced a terrifying prospect. He had no living male children. His only hope for continuing the dynasty lay with his daughters. A situation unheard of in the long history of the Habsburgs. The thought of his vast diverse lands being torn apart by succession disputes upon his death haunted him. To prevent this, he crafted a revolutionary document, a legal instrument intended to secure his daughters' right to inherit all Habsburg lands as an indivisible whole. In 1713, he issued the Pragmatic Sanction. The Pragmatic Sanction was not a decree that directly changed the daily lives of common people like a tax or a conscription order. Instead, it was a fundamental law of succession. It declared that all Habsburg hereditary lands, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and numerous other territories were indivisible and inseparable. More importantly, it established a system of primogeniture that allowed for female succession if there were no male heirs. This meant that, if Charles died without a son, his eldest daughter would inherit the entire empire. He spent the rest of his reign desperately trying to get this document recognized by the various estates within his own empire and by the other great powers of Europe. In the salons of Vienna, among the high nobility, the Pragmatic Sanction sparked intense debate and quiet scheming. Prince Eugen of Savoy, a revered military commander and trusted advisor, understood the political necessity of the document. He had seen empires fractured by succession crises. But many other nobles, particularly those in the ancient kingdoms, like Bohemia and Hungary, viewed the concept of female rule with deep skepticism, even hostility. Baron Imre, a Hungarian magnate, saw the sanction as an attempt to further centralize power in Vienna and undermine the traditional rights of the Hungarian estates. He argued that the Hungarian crown was elective in nature, not simply hereditary by Habsburg decree. The idea of a woman ruling Hungary, an idea foreign to their traditions, made him uneasy. He saw it as a violation of their historical liberties, a subtle threat to their distinct identity within the Habsburg realm. While they eventually formally accepted the sanction, their assent was often grudging, filled with reservations and conditions. Across Europe, in the courts of France, Bavaria, Spain, and Prussia, the Pragmatic Sanction was met with a cynical smile. Kings and ministers saw Charles VI's lack of a male heir not as a problem to be solved by legal documents, but as an opportunity to carve up the vast Habsburg inheritance for themselves. French diplomats offered empty assurances while secretly planning for the moment Charles would die. The King of Prussia, Frederick William I, and his son Frederick II saw the potential for seizing resource-rich Silesia, an integral part of the Habsburg lands. The formal recognition of the sanction by these powers often came at a steep price, involving territorial concessions or political favors which Charles reluctantly granted. Each signature was a temporary truce, not a genuine endorsement. When Charles VI died in 1740, his eldest daughter, Maria Theresa, inherited the entire Habsburg realm, just as the sanction intended. She was a young woman barely 23 years old and seemingly vulnerable. The ink on the signed treaties was barely dry when the great powers of Europe who had recognized the sanction immediately renounced their pledges. Frederick II of Prussia, seeing his chance, invaded Silesia, sparking the War of the Austrian Succession. This conflict engulfed Europe for 8 long years, drawing in almost every major power. For the common people, the Pragmatic Sanction, once a distant legal formality, now became a brutal reality. Young men like Anton, a peasant from Styria, found themselves conscripted into Maria Theresa's armies, forced to march across frozen landscapes, fighting and dying in battles over land and dynastic rights. They barely understood. His village, once concerned only with harvests and local taxes, now became a supply line for armies. Its resources plundered, its young men taken, families mourned sons who never returned. The war, sparked by a document meant to ensure peace and orderly succession, instead brought devastation and suffering on a scale few had ever witnessed. Maria Theresa, despite her youth and inexperience, proved to be a formidable ruler, fighting fiercely to defend her inheritance. The pragmatic sanction, though legally binding, ultimately did not prevent war. It merely defined the stakes, leading to a bloody and costly struggle for the very survival of the Habsburg monarchy. The fight to uphold its principles defined the early years of Maria Theresa's reign. Number 2. Leopold I's persecution of Hungarian Protestants, various edicts, late 17th century. In the late 17th century, the Kingdom of Hungary, though nominally under Habsburg rule, harbored a strong Protestant population and a powerful, independent-minded nobility. Emperor Leopold I, a devout Catholic and a staunch advocate for absolutist rule, viewed the Hungarian Protestants not only as heretics, but also as a political threat. He saw their faith as intertwined with their desire for greater autonomy and their occasional alliances with the Ottoman Turks, who still posed a significant danger to the empire. Driven by a desire for religious uniformity and political control, Leopold issued a series of edicts and pursued policies that intensified the persecution of Hungarian Protestants. These edicts and decrees, often issued through royal commissions or local authorities, aimed to suppress Protestantism and recatholize Hungary. They included the closure of Protestant churches and schools, the confiscation of their property, the banning of Protestant worship services, and the forced conversion of ministers and teachers. Protestant pastors were often arrested, tried for treason, and in some cases sentenced to galley. Slavery, a horrific fate. High offices in Hungary were increasingly reserved for Catholics, and the Catholic Church received strong state support to re-establish its dominance. In the bustling town of Debrecen, a center of Hungarian Protestantism, Pastor András witnessed the chilling effects of these edicts. For years, he had preached openly, his church a beacon for the Reformed faith. Then came the imperial commissioners, stern-faced men, accompanied by soldiers. His church was seized, its doors nailed shut. His precious library of theological texts was confiscated and burned in the town square. The smoke, a bitter testament to the suppression. András himself was arrested, subjected to a show trial, and accused of plotting against the emperor. He knew many of his colleagues had been sent to the galleys in Naples, chained to oars, enduring brutal conditions until death. András went into hiding, moving from village to village, holding secret services in barns and forests, keeping the flame of his faith alive, but always with the terrifying shadow of imperial arrest looming over him. The Hungarian nobility, both Catholic and Protestant, watched these events with a mix of fear and indignation. While Catholic nobles might not have shared the religious beliefs of their Protestant countrymen, many saw Leopold's heavy-handed tactics as a direct assault on Hungarian liberties and the ancient rights of the Hungarian estates. Count István, a powerful Hungarian lord, felt a deep sense of betrayal. He had always been loyal to the Habsburg crown, but he believed in the traditional autonomy of Hungary and its right to religious freedom. He saw the persecution as part of a larger plan to centralize power in Vienna and crush Hungarian independence. He joined the growing chorus of discontent, quietly supporting those who sought to resist imperial overreach. He knew that if the emperor could dictate their religion, he could dictate anything. Eroding the very essence of their ancient kingdom, the persecution ignited fierce resistance. Many Protestants, driven to desperation, joined various revolts against Habsburg rule, most notably the Krug rebellions, led by figures like Imre, Fokoli, and later Ferenc, Hrakoksi. These were not just religious wars. They were also struggles for Hungarian national identity and independence against perceived Habsburg tyranny. In the countryside, small groups of armed men, often led by dispossessed nobles or former soldiers, harassed imperial garrisons and targeted Catholic institutions. The empire found itself entangled in a protracted and bloody conflict in Hungary, diverting resources and manpower from other fronts. Thus Susanna, a young woman from a village near the Turkish border, saw her life turned upside down by the escalating conflict. Her brother, a young Protestant, fled to join the Kuruk rebels rather than face forced conversion or conscription into the imperial army. Her family's farm was repeatedly plundered, first by imperial troops looking for rebels, then by rebels looking for supplies. She lived in constant fear, the distant sound of cannon fire, a grim reminder of the ongoing struggle. The edicts, intended to bring religious unity and imperial control, had instead plunged Hungary into decades of brutal civil war and instability, fostering a deep and lasting resentment against Habsburg rule. The policies of Leopold I, rather than quelling dissent, solidified a powerful Hungarian nationalist sentiment that would simmer for centuries. Number 1. Ferdinand II's Edict of Restitution of 1629. The Holy Roman Empire was already tearing itself apart. The 30 Years' War, a brutal conflict fueled by religious differences, had ravaged Central Europe for over a decade. Catholic and Protestant princes, bolstered by foreign powers, fought relentlessly their armies. Emperor Ferdinand II, a fervent Catholic and staunch champion of the Counter-Reformation, saw the war not just as a political struggle, but as a holy crusade to restore the supremacy of Catholicism across the empire. He believed that the Edict of Restitution issued in March 1629 would be a decisive blow against Protestantism and a crucial step towards achieving his vision of a unified Catholic empire. The Edict of Restitution was a bold and aggressive move. It demanded the immediate return of all church lands that had been secularized, taken by Protestant princes and cities since the Peace of Passau in 1552. This meant hundreds of monasteries, bishoprics, and other ecclesiastical properties that had been under Protestant control for decades, sometimes even centuries, were to be handed back to the Catholic Church. It also reasserted the principle of quaes regio, agius religio, whose realm his religion from the Peace of Augsburg, 1555, but applied it strictly, excluding Calvinists and allowing Catholic rulers to force Protestant subjects to convert or immigrate. In a prosperous town in Saxony, Johann, a Lutheran farmer, heard the news of the edict with a chilling dread. His family had farmed their land, once part of a Catholic monastery, for 3 generations since the Reformation. They had built their lives on it, established their church, and raised their children in the Lutheran faith. Now armed imperial commissioners, accompanied by soldiers, arrived in his village, demanding the return of the land to the Catholic abbot, who had been exiled decades ago. Johann watched in despair as his fields, his home, and even his small Lutheran church were reclaimed. His pastor was expelled, and the villagers were told they must either convert to Catholicism or leave. Johann and his family faced an impossible choice: abandon their faith or abandon the land that had sustained them for so long. He knew of neighbors who packed meager belongings, preparing for an uncertain journey to a Protestant territory, their faces etched with fear and fury. The Protestant princes, already weary from years of war, were incandescent with rage. Frederick, the Duke of Württemberg, who had seen his duchy ravaged by imperial armies, viewed the Edict of Restitution as an unbearable provocation. It threatened to strip him of vast portions of his territory and undermine his authority within his own lands. He and other Protestant leaders saw it as a blatant violation of past treaties and an attempt to completely dismantle the religious and political gains of the Reformation. They understood that if the emperor could simply reclaim lands and dictate religious adherence in such a manner, their very existence as independent Protestant rulers was at stake. The edict, far from bringing peace, reigned into conflict with a ferocity that surprised even those accustomed to the war's brutality. It galvanized their resistance and pushed them into alliances with foreign powers. Even Catholic France, who saw the emperor's growing power as a threat to the balance of power in Europe. For the Catholic princes and clergy, the edict was a cause for celebration. But even among them, there was unease. Many saw it as a bold assertion of imperial power, but also a dangerously radical one. Cardinal Ottavio, a powerful Catholic prince, bishop, initially welcomed the restoration of church lands. He dispatched his own representatives to reclaim properties that had been lost for decades. However, he soon realized the immense practical difficulties and the sheer scale of the opposition it provoked. The implementation of the edict was chaotic and violent. Imperial troops, often unpaid and brutal, were used to enforce the restitutions, leading to widespread looting, destruction, and further suffering for the civilian population, regardless of their faith. The edict, instead of simplifying the religious landscape, turned every town and village into a potential battlefield, every property claim into a violent confrontation. The Edict of Restitution, intended to restore imperial authority and Catholic dominance, achieved the opposite. It deepened the religious divide, extended the war, and invited further foreign intervention. It convinced the Protestant states, and even some Catholic ones, that Ferdinand II sought absolute power, not just religious unity. Johann, the farmer, eventually left his ancestral home, joining a wave of refugees seeking safety and religious freedom. His life and the lives of countless others were shattered by an edict that, in its unwavering zeal, only fueled the flames of Europe's most destructive conflict, ensuring that the 30 Years' War would continue its devastating course for nearly 2 more decades.